Hello and welcome to another Times Rated Frontline recap. Now, I'm going to point you at some clips of some of the interviews we've done this week because they're absolutely fascinating. But I would recommend that you go to our channel and watch the full-length interviews. But there's a few that I want to pull out to the front. I'm Philip Ingram. I currently present Times Rated Frontline. I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer, and I commentate on all matters geopolitics, defence, cybersecurity, security, terrorism, and anything else that people ask me to. But let's get into the first interview that I'm going to point you out this week, and that's with Maxim Tucker. Have a little look at his interview here.
Well, it looks like Russian troops have overrun Ukrainian positions all throughout the city, and then Ukraine has had to launch counterattacks to try and get and clear Russian soldiers from positions. Speaking to soldiers who've been withdrawing from the city lately, they told about it being really, really difficult scenarios where you didn't know where Ukrainian positions were, where Russian positions were, having to walk out on foot for kilometers. And this area of the kind of in which they can withdraw is gradually decreasing. It's now just a couple of kilometers wide. And anyway, as you walk out of the city, you're harried by drones. Obviously, Ukraine has sent in special forces. We've seen that dramatic footage of Ukrainian special forces going by helicopter. And that seems to be an attempt to widen that area to try and secure an open land area where Ukrainian troops can pull out and get logistics in. But it seems like it might have passed the point of no return now, where it's not easy for Ukrainian troops to withdraw when they're kind of in amongst the Russians and there are so many drones in the air.
Because at the moment, the reporting is that the commanders are stopping short of a full-scale withdrawal. Is that right?
Well, so we know that some troops have been withdrawn. So we've been speaking to them, but the Ukrainians are saying that there is not a full-scale withdrawal. It may be just a rotation of troops. Other troops have gone in. We've seen that the Skala 425 Assault Regiment have gone all the way and reclaimed some territory taken by the Russians in the center of Pokrovsk. We saw them clear the city administration building and raise the Ukrainian flag over it again. And so I think what we're seeing is because of the tactics of Russia's kind of infiltration in small groups tactics, moving forward and advancing, but only in small numbers, that does make it quite easy for Ukrainian troops to then go in and clear them out. But the problem is Ukrainian troops can only do that so many times, and the Russians keep sending more and more and more troops in to infiltrate these areas.
So are we talking about a situation then whereby Ukrainian troops are inevitably getting trapped in Pokrovsk?
Well, I think some Ukrainian troops in the south of Pokrovsk may already be trapped. It will be very difficult for them to get out. Other Ukrainian troops may be looking to try and get out via this small opening that is being held by military intelligence or Ukraine special forces. But even that is going to be very, very difficult. I think the real big problem that Ukraine has now is in Minograd, where they have kind of lots of large units with vehicles, with equipment that are not going to be able to get out of this small gap. They'll only be able to kind of walk out. And whether Ukraine decides that it will try and break them out from the north instead of pushing them through, getting them withdrawing through Pokrovsk, which is incredibly dangerous right now.
So just tell me about that neighbouring city. Where is it exactly, and what's its significance to Pokrovsk?
So Minograd is part of the Pokrovsk conglomeration. It's a separate city, but it's kind of joined by houses through the middle. It's just a few miles away to the east. It is almost encircled now because of what's happening in Pokrovsk. The only route that is for Ukrainian forces to supply and get logistics through into Minograd is through Pokrovsk. But there was this counteroffensive around the Dobropilya area where Ukrainians made some gains that looked at some point that it might be able to break out some of the encirclement, the kind of northern part of the encirclement from troops in Minograd. But there are really precious troops for Ukraine in Minograd. They've got paratroopers, they've got Marines, like highly motivated, skilled, well-equipped units there. And losing them en masse would be really a dramatic blow for Ukraine.
And it's been taken 21 months, I think, for Russia to make this kind of advance on Pokrovsk. And they've devised these new tactics, as you say, to do so. How have they worked exactly? How different are they? And are they particular to this area, to an urban environment?
They're not particular to this area. They've also used tree lines and hedgerows to move forward small groups, and they try and find a building that they might then group together in. They send a few, one at a time, two at a time, and then stay in one place until there's a kind of platoon-sized force, and then they attack somewhere. This works better in once they've crept into an urban area because it's easier to hide, it's easier to move around in. But it also means that Ukrainians, when they find the Russians, they can hit them with drones or that they can counterattack them more easily because they're only small groups. And it's not something that's going to be able to allow the Russians to have a strategic breakthrough because it's only small groups of people on foot. So this is why it's taken 21 months to get from Avdiivka, which is only kind of 30 miles away, to Pokrovsk. And it's taken such a long time. And now people are talking about the threat that is posed to this fortress agglomeration, which is Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk, this kind of remaining fortress belt of Ukrainian major cities. But if you're applying these tactics to that situation, it's going to take them again several years to be able to take over those even larger cities.
So that's what's next, is it, the fortress belt, if they succeed in taking Pokrovsk?
Well, this is one of the reasons that Ukraine and Russia have been fighting so fiercely for Pokrovsk, is that it's the last major city in the Donbass before you head west towards Dnipro. And if the Ukrainians don't hold the positions in Pokrovsk, then there are large open fields along the main road to Pavlohrad, which is a really important industrial base for the Ukrainians, and Dnipro. There are no major settlements on that route. There are a couple of villages, but they would be relatively easy to take. So if you're thinking about Ukrainian defensive lines over winter, it means if they're not in Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians are in the field, they're exposed, they're cold, and it's going to be very difficult to hold those positions if the Russians choose to drive west into Dnipro. If they choose to go further east towards this fortress belt, then Ukrainians will need to reconsider how they organize their defense, and it's going to be centered around Dobrapilya, I think.
Now, this is where Maxim is reporting about the situation in Pokrovsk. There's a lot of detail, and Pokrovsk is this focal point on the front line in the east, in the Donbass. It's become almost an emotional objective for the Russians. The Ukrainians have been hanging on to it for an awful lot longer than people had anticipated, but it's costing the Russians huge casualties on a daily basis. 700 troops dead or wounded approximately every day. And that's frightening. And whilst the Ukrainians can continue to inflict those sorts of casualties, that's probably why they're hanging on, but they're hanging on by their fingernails at the moment. And Maxim explains the complexity that there is with the battles that there are around in the city. Little pocketed battles, no overall control over anywhere. You can go and take a building, and 2 hours later, the other side has come and taken it back again, because you can't afford the troops that you need to secure it and hold it and build your defenses up, especially with the drones that there are, with the air war that's going on around as well. It is an extremely complex and fluid battlefield. There are no linear lines for people to analyze and say the Russians have advanced this amount and pushed the Ukrainians back. The Russians are slowly advancing through Pokrovsk more and more, but at a massive, massive cost. And Ukrainian, just to the north of the city, Ukrainian troops have been trying to break out from an area called Myronohad. Please excuse my pronunciation. And that seems to have been cut off, been encircled by the Russians. That's some of their more experienced troops that are in there, and they are fairly well equipped. So I don't think the Ukrainians would want to afford to lose that. But we've seen some bold moves over the last week where Ukrainian commandos, led by General Budanov, the head of the HUR or GUR, led an airborne or air mobile raid in to try and reopen some of the positions and push the Russians back. And from the Ukrainian perspective, it's been described as a successful operation. The Russians said that they had destroyed the commandos that came in. I don't think that happened. But there's an awful lot of disinformation going on around what's happening inside Pokrovsk. And it's that information battle that means trying to analyze exactly what's going on, looking at the sources of information that's out there is particularly difficult. And this is why Maxim's got a really good understanding. He's spoken to people on the ground. He's been there in the past. So go and look at his interview, please. And this ties in with the next videos that I just want you to show. It's a couple of videos filmed of Pokrovsk itself. Have a look here. So in the first video, we can see the overflight of Pokrovsk. We can see the levels of damage that there are. Every block, every building seems to have been damaged quite quite badly. But there are also evidence that there's still some civilians living there. We can see some people chopping up wood for their fires. And I think this just gives you an oversight as to how badly damaged the city is. And it's of no strategic value to any side anymore from a military logistic perspective. It was seen as a central logistic hub. Of course, it's valuable for the Ukrainians because they're costing the Russians up to 700, 800 troops a day trying to take it, and they're fixing them. A fixing operation is a distinct military operation. The second little video here shows something else that is going on. Have a look at this. And this is, of course, the Ukrainians putting their flag back up in the central administrative building. The Russians had made a point about a week ago, 10 days ago, that they had captured this building and put the Russian flag up. The Ukrainians have wandered back in again, but it's small groups of determined men, a couple of people here sneaking through the rubble, getting in and putting the flag back up again, all part of the wider information operations that are going on through direct action. That Ukrainian flag will probably be taken down by the Russians again fairly quickly and replaced. It shows the fluid nature of what's going on in the battlefield. So our next interview I want to point you at is with Rob Fox, and Rob Fox is looking at some of the wider issues. Have a look at his interview here.
Very difficult to assess. It is having an impact. That is undeniable. But I'm now very sceptical about statistics and relative values that are coming out, and I'm sure we're going to mention a lot of statistics. 40% of Russia's refining capacity. I don't really know if it really is so, but there is a cutback in exports, and of course that they've managed to, with the threat of sanctions, to staunch the flow of petrol products to Pakistan and to India, and China seems to be reluctant to buy, though it is continuing to sell and is still absolutely vital for the aerial part of the Russian order of battle. It really provides vital material to the Russian drone fleet. I think the things you have to look at very quickly is it's interesting how the Russian presence in the Black Sea is really being degraded. An important refinery for Crimea has been knocked out, and they must be desperate now. We'd heard of petrol rationing. And the other thing they have to look at with it, like water shortages, has been going on. But there is something that since we last spoke, I've been trying to interrogate and investigate exactly what is happening to the Russian rail network, because this is proving absolutely critical. The sanitized figures say that 10% of rail freight traffic is 10% down. That's a big whack at the economy. What is the rail really needed for? Of course, you prioritize rail for logistics, but above all for the movement of troops. And it looks as if that is being hit very hard. And I think instead of looking forward all the time at the battle of what they're bringing up to the AOR, the area of operations in the wider Ukrainian front, we ought to look deep, as you say, well beyond what they can bring up from the reserves and in the rear. And this is where these attacks, and you hear them at 1,500 kilometers range, 2,000 kilometers range, it really is quite something. And you just have to, that it's like, I say, the Conjuring Act. You have to look at the great distraction. Where are you being distracted to? And one of the glaring things is there's been the call out of reserves. Putin has said they're going to call out all the reserves for the war effort over the next 2 or 3 months. And that is really significant. But we are coming to a crisis point. We love to talk about things like culminating points or limitations of exploitation and so on. I chuck the military jargon out of the window for a minute, but there's a real crisis point, and it's a crisis point not only for Russia, but above all for Ukraine, but for Europe and the Allies as well, particularly as Trump's long-term aim, if he has any, over Ukraine and Russia, seems to be unfathomable.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I'd like to drill more into the assignment of reservists to guard some of these oil refineries and other energy infrastructure. Is there a risk of that really backfiring on Putin? Because he's been very hesitant to let the reservists get involved in this conflict. It was one of the problems and one of the threats to the Kremlin when Kursk was invaded, and suddenly a lot of these reservists were being overrun when they never thought they were going to see combat at all. Could that backfire on the Kremlin if more conscripts effectively are drawn into this conflict?
I think he's very worried about local levies, local reserves, because it's a peculiarity as to how the Putin state security system works, because it's very different even from that Gorbachev, I suppose to use completely the wrong verb, but I will use it, enjoyed, as it were. Because one of the things that you have to point out that is so obvious compared with the crisis in the 80s, as things were coming to a critical point again, and it was triggered quite unexpectedly, sort of almost off stage by the Afghan crisis. They just felt that they were losing too many, and public opinion, or the opinion of the wives and widows and the wounded, really did affect things and did affect Gorbachev. And one could ask oneself, why isn't it happening to this extent at this time? But he hasn't. I was going to, sorry, very long sentence. What Putin doesn't have, I know he's got his own political party, but he doesn't have the Communist Party. He doesn't have the Communist Party apparatus, which was enormous and in depth, upon which Stalin relied, obviously, in his multiple purges, and particularly the purges in the 30s, and then the purges immediately after the Great Patriotic War, which were as savage, by my understanding, as those in the 30s. So I think we've mentioned on this broadcast before that how Putin, Xi are very wary of the spontaneous explosion out in the provinces or out in the further reaches of their imperium, their rule. What we would call in modern terms, I mean, it's an old term from the Middle Ages, a jacquerie. A jacquerie is a spontaneous explosion which comes from the bottom up, not the top down, of uncertain value, what they really want, but it is, I have just had enough. Get stuffed. And I think that that Putin is in some danger there, particularly as he has to appeal, in inverted commas, to the electorate for the elections coming through from the spring through to the summer, including the election for the Duma. It's a confidence vote in a way, and that's, as I said repeatedly, that was the genius of Alex Navalny. He didn't bother too much in Moscow to the end, and that's why he was causing real trouble. He was getting out further and further east, seeing where these Moscow imposed governors were very, very unpopular indeed. I'm answering your question too about the reserves. This is why he is wary of the reserves.
Now, Rob is talking about the damage to Russia's energy infrastructure and how it's affecting Putin's psychology in Russia itself. It's bringing the war to the average Russians. They're becoming much more aware of what it is that's going on, and that's something that Putin is really scared of. Putin is taking additional risks by using some of the conscripts and the reservists that he has around to go and guard this infrastructure. But using those troops, it means that they can't be used to relieve other troops that are potentially needed for the front line. And of course, they have to be equipped. And the threat's coming from the air, and it's air defense equipment that is coming in, and that's been taken away from the front line, and therefore is putting additional pressure on Russia. But I think the real pressure is the effect it's having on fuel prices at the petrol and diesel pumps. And the average Russian is now seeing the fuel prices, if they can get hold of fuel, going through the roof. That is impacting the cost of living, that is impacting inflation, and that is impacting the Russian economy. At some stage, the Russian people will turn around and say, enough is enough, because they've got a history of doing that. And Rob Fox explains this exceptionally well. I urge you not just to watch the clip that we put in there, but to go and watch the whole interview that I had with Robert. It's always fascinating. The third interview I want to point you at this week is one that I did with Ryan Ramsey. Now, Ryan is a former nuclear-powered submarine commander with the Royal Navy, and him and I delve into almost geek levels of understanding nuclear technology, because Vladimir Putin has been talking about the Poseidon nuclear torpedo, the Armageddon torpedo that will put a nuclear tsunami, radioactive tsunami over cities, and of course the Skyfall nuclear-powered cruise missile that the Russians have come out, and that stimulated talk in the United States about restarting nuclear testing and other things. The nuclear saber is being rattled. So Ryan and I get into the detail on that, but also looking at missiles. We talk about Tomahawk and how much of a game changer it is. And of course, Ryan Ramsey, his submarine carried Tomahawk cruise missiles. He's used them in anger, and therefore he explains very well the challenges that there are around Tomahawk. This is one not to miss. The Russians were saying this is a game changer. It can remain flying and people won't know what target it's going for. But you look at the number of surveillance systems that there are in space, and not just military systems, but civilian systems that are looking across different spectrums. Do you think there is any hope that this could remain hidden from what is watching down and looking for these sorts of things?
No, I don't. I think, like you just rightly pointed out, the number of satellites that are up there, the number of surveillance assets that are available worldwide now, not just from the West, but China and everywhere else. It's absolutely significant, and equally that's includes open source intelligence. So it would be easy to find whatever it is and keep it up there. But the message, if you're saying we don't know where it's going to land and we're just going to fly this missile around continuously until such times as we decide where it goes, you're going to elicit a response from totally different players than you intended it for. So you fly that thing near China, China's going to see that as a potentially offensive thing. They don't know whether that's Russian or not, so they're going to respond to that. Japan would do the same. It's just a ludicrous idea to have this missile that's just flying around continuously. It's an offensive capability that you use once, and only when you've reached that point in a conflict.
And again, to my mind, you could only use it with a nuclear warhead on it, because otherwise, if you put a conventional warhead on it, you've just got a flying dirty bomb if it goes and attacks something. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that. So, I mean, the fact is, if you put a conventional warhead on it and then targeted somewhere, you've got some form of nuclear response. So in fact, it just doesn't make any sense. And the other bit about tactical nukes, I mean, even the West are talking about tactical nukes, is once you've launched a tactical nuke, you've got strategic response that's coming in your direction, because you have no idea. You can plan as much as you want for where the fallout for radiation and everything else goes, but you can't control it. It's controlled by the weather and a whole load of other factors. So the long-term implications of the use of any nuclear warhead, whether it be tactical or strategic, is absolutely globally significant.
Yeah, well, I think people misunderstand the word tactical, including lots of military commanders, and especially army military commanders, because there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. It falls into the criteria for some of the arms control measures, really, but it will elicit, as you say, a strategic response. But that's quite clear on this Skyfall missile. The other big one that's hit the press this week, and Putin is pushing, is the Poseidon Armageddon nuclear torpedo, and apparently there's a submarine that can carry 14 of them, and this is a game changer because it will create radioactive tsunamis that will flood cities. What do you make of that? You're a submarine man.
Well, I mean, you only have to look back through history of when they've done underwater tests of nuclear weapons from the 50s and 60s, and you can see exactly the response from the site. And they're talking about similar size warhead, effectively, and you can see the response. And it's not a tsunami that takes over a country or anything else like that. It's considerably less than that. I wouldn't want to be on the submarine that's actually firing it just to see. I think you fire one and then that's the end. So it doesn't. I don't know what that threat is supposed to provide. It feels like Putin's almost desperate with this stuff, and it sounds fanciful, but you lose all credibility. The one thing about having a threat or having deterrence is it needs to be credible, and for me, Poseidon's not credible at all.
And finally, when we're looking at the US response to all of this, we've got Donald Trump and JD Vance talking about nuclear testing because on his way back from China, Donald Trump said that US was going to resume nuclear testing. However, if we listen to what it is that they have to say, I'll bring a couple of points out. Here's their videos here.
Are you talking about literally resuming underground nuclear detonation tests?
You'll find out very soon, but we're going to do some testing, yeah. Other countries do it. If they're going to do it, we're going to do it.
Okay, you can't clarify whether you'll resume.
I'm not going to say yet. I mean, I know exactly what we're doing, where we're doing it, but other countries are doing it, and if other countries do it, we do it.
Mr. President,
well, look, I'll answer that very briefly, but I really do want to focus on the shutdown that is affecting the American people. I think the president's truth speaks for itself. We have a big arsenal, obviously. The Russians have a large nuclear arsenal. The Chinese have a large nuclear arsenal. Sometimes you've got to test it to make sure that it's functioning and working properly. We've been working very closely, even with nations that we don't have the best relations with, to try to limit nuclear proliferation. The president's going to keep on working on that, but it's an important part of American national security to make sure that this nuclear arsenal we have actually functions properly, and that's part of a testing regime. To be clear, we know that it does work properly, but you got to keep on top of it over time, and the president just wants to make sure that we do that.
And the points I want to bring out with this are, there's a lot of, you could describe it as almost waffle. They're not saying anything of real substance, and there seems to be a degree of confusion in Donald Trump as to whether it's testing of warheads or testing of nuclear command and control or procedures or delivery mechanisms and everything else. And JD Vance highlights that the delivery mechanisms, the command and control, everything around the use of nuclear is continuously tested. But I think there is more to all of this, because the nuclear deterrence is all based around one thing, and that one thing is strategic ambiguity. And I think the conversation that we see from both Donald Trump and JD Vance, his vice president, just adds to that strategic ambiguity. Maybe not in a way that we'd have expected, but it's important. And that strategic ambiguity is something that has kept us away from nuclear war ever since the US dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to finish the Second World War. Let's hope we never get back to that again. So thank you for watching Recap this week. If you want exclusive access to our videos, please sign up for Times Radio membership. And of course, you can then leave questions, which we'll answer in the Q&A, and you'll get our videos early. But if you want to listen to us on your favorite podcast channel, just go to wherever you get your podcasts and search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.